In his condemnation of the money changers, Jesus wasn't just addressing a dishonest practice of his time, he was delivering a timeless message that still resonates. Imagine, if you will, the temple of God, our very being, transformed into a marketplace. Jesus foresaw this invasion, not only by local merchants, but by the ideological descendants of these money changers, the Fiat central bankers. Fast forward to today, and we see this prophecy fulfilled. Bankers, with the help of big tech, big pharma, the media, and the government, have encroached upon the sacred space of the human temple. They've turned it into a den of thieves. These powerful, centralized entities are colluding to commodify our personal data, monetize our health, shape our reality, and skew governance towards profit over people. It's a modern desecration of sacred space. Just as Jesus stood against the desecration of the temple, we too must stand against the exploitation of the human temple. It's time to reclaim the sanctity of our existence.
The depression still waxed strong as the powers of deflation reached out to confiscate homes, to capture farms, and to keep that ever-marching army of jobless upon our streets, wondering when God in his mercy would lift his hand. I dared you and challenged you to organize so that the people, if not the president, would drive the money changers from the temple, and you did it. They believe that the Federal Reserve Bank has the right to coin and regulate the value of money. They're not even Americans, these so-called Democrats and Republicans.
Before we dive into the significance of this event, let's take a moment to understand the language of signs and symbols, a cornerstone of Jesus' teachings. Symbols are incredibly important as they serve as conduits for deeper truths. Jesus often used symbolism to convey profound insights through his parables. In Mark 4:10-12, he explains that the secret of the kingdom of God is granted to some, but remains veiled in parables for others. This ensures comprehension only for those with ears to hear, highlighting the encrypted nature of his message, which he deciphered privately for his disciples. The idea of the fractal nature of reality, summed up by the axiom, as above, so below, emphasizes the universality and constancy of this symbolic language. These symbols transcend time, acting as an unchanging medium of communication that echoes the harmony between the macrocosm and the microcosm. Confucius once said that the world is governed by signs and symbols, not solely by words and laws. Symbols, by their nature, transcend the limitations of language and time, acting as vessels for profound truths and shared understanding. They encompass concrete objects, images, words, or actions that can carry meanings beyond their literal interpretations. Whether universal or culturally specific, symbols invoke deep cultural, social, or personal significance, resonating with individuals across generations. Unlike words, which evolve and change with time and cultural blending, symbols retain their potency as immutable carriers of knowledge and wisdom. Within symbols are encrypted messages that transcend verbal articulation, passed down through generations to those initiated in their meanings. This intrinsic importance of symbols is especially evident in faith and religion, where exoteric truths are conveyed through words, while esoteric wisdom is veiled within symbols. The occult, or hidden meaning of symbols, underscores their role as vessels of deeper truths, accessible only to those who hold the keys to their decryption. Indeed, this reality permeates our daily lives, as evidenced by the symbolic language of dreams. Dreams, composed of archetypal symbols, serve as a bridge between the conscious and unconscious mind, offering insights into the depths of our psyche and the collective unconscious. In essence, symbols are the silent yet potent messengers that speak to the essence of our existence, transcending the boundaries of language and time.
While I live a conscious life, all the time a myth is played in the unconscious. A myth that extends over centuries. Namely, archetypal ideas, a stream of archetypal ideas that goes on through one individual, through the centuries. You see, it is like a continuous stream. And that comes then to the daylight in the great movements. Say in political movements or in spiritual movements. When you observe the world, you see people, you see houses, you see the sky, you see tangible objects. But when you observe yourself within, you see moving images, a world of images. It is demonstrated to us in our days what the power of the psyche is of man, how important it is to know something about it, but we know nothing about it.
So symbolism is not opposed to a kind of neutral physical reality. Rather, symbolism is the very manner in which we perceive and organize the unlimited field of information. And one of the parishioners was explaining how the Greek word symbol refers to a place where two things meet, where two rivers become one river, for example. And that symbolism does not come about by adding a kind of metaphoric meaning on top of events, but is the very bringing together of events, the formation of analogies, the process of synthetic compression of multiple level of events, of patterns, of relationships. And it's the bringing of all those things together which constitute symbolism, but also constitutes the very manner in which we engage the world. And so, see, there is no reality which is not symbolic. The nature of our existence in the world is symbolic. Events coalesce around centers of meaning through our attention and our memory. We all experience this constantly, and if one is attentive, what it does, it makes the world a magical place.
When Jesus speaks, his words reverberate not only locally, but resonate across space, time, and dimensions, addressing timeless truths applicable to all fractal versions of reality. Just as in his parables, where Jesus conveys profound truths through symbolic narratives, the temple encounter unveils deeper layers of meaning. Consider the parable of the sower, where seeds symbolize the spread of God's word, or the parable of the Good Samaritan, which embodies compassion and unity. Likewise, the parable of the prodigal son signifies divine forgiveness and unconditional love, while the mustard seed illustrates the growth and expansiveness of God's kingdom. The parable of the lost sheep portrays God's unwavering concern for each individual, emphasizing the significance of redemption and salvation. Jesus speaks in encrypted metaphors and allegories, and only those with the keys can decipher the true meaning. His messages, whether through parables or actions like the temple encounter, are layered with symbolism that invites deeper reflection and understanding.
And I would even contend that there is a cosmic way of remembering events. And all of these levels of attention and memory will not appear the same. The more we move away from the idiosyncratic how my day went stories, the more we move towards remembering events which have universal significance. The more this memory will appear symbolic, condensed. It has to be, so that it can be attended to and remembered by larger and larger groups over larger and larger spans of time. And so, for example, in the Bible, you can actually see that in the very unfolding of the large story. The more you go back, let's say towards Genesis, the more the stories appear condensed, symbolic, universal. The forms are compressed through images that reveal more and more meaning. So, does that mean that what's in the Bible does not describe events? Of course it describes events. The problem is that we think that all events are the same. We think that Adam, which means man as such, ate the fruit of the knowledge of good and evil, becoming self-conscious of his mortality, having been tempted by a serpent, is on the same level, the same type of event, washing the dishes. That's the problem. The events in Genesis happened. They're just being remembered at a cosmic level using narrative structures and images that compress so much into them that people have written thousands of books unfolding the implicit meanings contained in those primordial stories. There will be no one writing thousands of books of how I did the dishes last night. It's like, if any event in the entire world has definitely happened, it is the story in Genesis 2 and the fall. And just because computer brains like Sam Harris cannot perceive hierarchy in being, a hierarchy of events, and a hierarchy in the manner in which we describe events, just means that they're forced to discount those stories to their peril and to our peril. The stories which our ancestors for thousands of years considered to be the most important and foundational stories, foundational structures of our being, and the underlying origin of what it means to be human. And then you wonder why everyone is so confused and disillusioned. So does a Christian have to believe that the gospel describes events? Yes. Does a Christian have to believe that those descriptions have the modern journalistic or forensic type of description? No. Does a Christian have to believe in the resurrection of the body? Yes. Do we need to technically describe, like a surveyor would give a detailed analysis of a terrain, what the resurrection is? No. The resurrection imposes itself as the culmination of a giant pattern, a pattern which includes the natural patterns of death and rebirth, the seasons, the rotation of the cosmic bodies, a pattern which includes all the stories of the escape of the underworld, the crossing of the flood, and all the other tales of life rising out of death found in cosmic stories we remember and attend to until today, even in our movies, in our TV shows, video games, comic books. I mean, the story of the resurrection is everywhere if you can see it.
The temple encounter, where Jesus confronts the money changers in the temple, holds profound symbolic and metaphorical significance that goes beyond its historical context. This event is particularly striking because it involved a violent and verbal and physical assault, completely out of character for the Prince of Peace.
Jerusalem! The faithful city! She that was full of justice has become a harlot! Stop him! Have you not heard? Has it not been told you from the beginning?
What are your multitude of sacrifices to me, says the Lord? Bring forth no more vain offerings! Call the roll, the other right. My money thief!
Is a house of prayer!
He's a fool! We must stone him to death!
And you have turned it into a den of thieves!
Man into the prophet!
Jesus, known for his message of love and peace, was so aggressive that this event becomes even more significant and deserves close examination. It wasn't an act of impulse. The scripture says he took the time to braid a whip out of cords. During this time, he could have changed his mind, calmed down, but instead, his anger seemed to fuel as he braided the whip. This particular group of men were so repulsive to the Son of God, he was disgusted by their practices. This was one of the final acts of Jesus, and soon afterward, likely related to this event, he was executed by the money changers. Two of the last and most significant events in the life of Jesus are related to the temple. In the other event, Jesus entered the temple and told the Jewish scholars that the temple would be torn down and he would rebuild it in 3 days.
The temple is not mere stone. It is the house of God. It cannot be destroyed as long as God lives here. Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will make it rise again.
It took centuries to build this temple. Do you think you can rebuild it in 3 days?
You have said it. But you have not understood.
As mentioned in John chapter 2, the Jews were so offended by this that they picked up stones and wanted to execute him right there. In this light, the temple encounter symbolizes the cleansing of the sacred space, purging it of worldly corruption and restoring its sanctity as a dwelling place for divine presence and spiritual enlightenment. The concept of the temple in spiritual traditions goes beyond its physical structure, reflecting a profound symbolism tied to the human body. The primary purpose of the temple is to serve as a sacred place for communion with the divine. While this is the more obvious interpretation, a deeper look reveals that the body itself is considered a temple of God. In the New Testament, Jesus warns against allowing the money changers to enter and desecrate this sacred space, symbolizing the corruption and distractions that can defile our spiritual purity. As the body is a temple of God, it aligns with the biblical measurements according to the measure of man, Revelation 21:17. This signifies that the divine presence is designed to dwell within us. Furthermore, in Acts chapter 7, it states, "The Most High dwells not in temples made with hands," emphasizing that true sanctity resides within the human spirit. This is echoed in 1 Corinthians chapter 3, which reminds us, "Know you not that you are a temple of God, and the Spirit of God dwells within you?" Thus, our bodies are sacred vessels, and maintaining their purity is essential for nurturing our divine connection. By understanding this deeper symbolism, we see that keeping our physical and spiritual selves pure is crucial. Just as the temple was meant to be a place of prayer and communion with God, our minds and bodies as temples should be kept sacred and free from corruption. In ancient cultures, the temple of worship was often patterned after the human body, reflecting a profound connection between physical structures and spiritual concepts. Take the Hebrew temple, particularly the Temple of Solomon, as an example. It was an exemplary model with its three main sections: the outer court, the holy place, and the Holy of Holies. These sections correspond to different aspects of human consciousness and the spiritual journey. Let's start with the outer court, the outermost section of the temple complex. It was accessible to all worshippers and contained an altar for burnt offerings and a large bronze basin known as the Bronze Sea for the priest's ceremonial washings. Symbolically, the outer court represents the physical body, or the material world. It's the realm of the senses, where interactions with the physical and external environment occur. Just as the outer court was a place for initial cleansing and preparation, the physical body is the starting point for spiritual practice and discipline. Next, we have the holy place, reserved exclusively for priests. This section contained the golden lampstand, or menorah, and the table of showbread, and the altar of incense. The holy place is associated with the heart center, or the emotional and mental aspects of human consciousness. It represents the realm of inner purification, devotion, and spiritual understanding. Only those dedicated to spiritual service could enter the holy place, mirroring the inner work required to cultivate a heart that is pure and attuned to higher spiritual truths. Finally, we reach the Holy of Holies, the innermost and most sacred section of the temple, which housed the Ark of the Covenant. This symbolized the presence of God amongst his people. The high priest could enter this section only once a year on the Day of Atonement, or Yom Kippur, to offer sacrifices for the forgiveness of sins. This sacred space, often associated with the third eye, or crown chakra, located at the center of the forehead or the top of the head, respectively. The Holy of Holies represents the highest level of spiritual consciousness and direct communion with the divine. It's the ultimate goal of the spiritual journey, where one experiences unity with God and profound spiritual insight. In these esoteric traditions, the architecture and symbolism of the temple reflect the inner journey of the individual seeker. Each section of the temple represents a stage of spiritual awakening and progression towards union with the divine. The outer court corresponds to the initial engagement with the spiritual path. The holy place signifies the deepening of inner spiritual practices, and the Holy of Holies represents the culmination of the journey where one attains the highest state of spiritual consciousness and direct experience of the divine presence in communion with God. Who are the money changers? The ideological descendants of the money changers in ancient times are the modern bankers. These individuals now control today's financial system through the fiat monetary system, which is characterized by central banking and the dubious practice of fractional reserve banking. This system, which is somewhat like a Ponzi scheme, allows banks to lend out significantly more money than they actually hold in reserves. Essentially, they create money out of thin air, perpetuating cycles of debt and inflation. These modern bankers operate based on greed, prioritizing profit above all else, regardless of the cost to society. Their relentless drive to monetize everything transforms essential human needs and services into mere commodities, further entrenching economic disparities. Operating solely on the principles of profit and greed, they manipulate financial markets, influence political systems, and jeopardize economic stability. Often, it's the broader society that ends up bearing the consequences of their averse-driven actions. The founding fathers of the United States warned about the money changers. James Madison said, "History records that the money changers have used every form of abuse, intrigue, deceit, and violent means possible to maintain their control over governments by controlling money and its issuance." He was aware of the money changers. He saw them invading the early temple of the United States. Andrew Jackson, after voting against renewing the charter for the Central Bank of the U.S., said, "Should I let you go on, you will ruin 50,000 families, and that will be my sin. You are a den of vipers and thieves." What's wrong with the money changers? The money changers are driven by the lower vibratory forces: profit, power, position, and greed. While their services might be necessary sometimes, in this instance, they took advantage of their position and installed themselves as gatekeepers in the temple. By doing so, they prevented believers from using the temple for its intended purpose: to commune with God. This interference distorted the sacred space, turning it into a place of commerce rather than a sanctuary for spiritual connection. The plans of the money changers. You couldn't conduct your temple activities without going through these gatekeepers. In the time of Jesus, the money changers set up a marketplace inside the temple. They could have set it up outside, but they didn't. This marketplace involved two main activities: the exchange of currency and the purchase of animals for sacrifice. The Tyrian shekel used in the temple bore the image of the Phoenician god Melkart, or Baal, or Beelzebub, as he was known to the Jews. During special holidays, believers would travel from different provinces to the temple to sacrifice an animal for the forgiveness of their sins. They carried different currencies and brought money instead of animals for practicality. This high traffic time to the money changers was like Black Friday. The main idea is that the money changers took advantage of the people's devotion to God in order to make a profit. They essentially turned the temple into a marketplace. But the temple was intended to be a place of prayer, a place of communion with God, a sacred place. Jesus' outrage becomes clearer when we consider the full picture. Not only did the money changers set up their exchange and marketplace inside the temple, altering the environment and ambience of the sacred space, but they also mandated transactions with a coin that had the image of a false god or lesser god. Placing the image of a god in the temple is considered an abomination. For instance, an image of Zeus was placed in the Hebrew temple. It was seen as the abomination of desecration. In this event, we see regular transactions taking place inside the temple using a coin with the image of Baal, which the Hebrews found deeply offensive due to their long history stemming from their captivity in Babylon centuries earlier. This context helps us understand the depth of Jesus' anger and the significance of his actions. Today, the money changers have invaded the sacred space of the human temple. In the digital age, our DNA and data have become the currency of the temple, where profit-driven entities engage in wheeling and dealing at the expense of our privacy and autonomy. Our data trails, or metadata, comprising our thoughts, perceptions, and intentions, are now harvested and commodified, ripe for exploitation by the money changers. Through the monetization of our data, these entities infiltrate the very sanctum of our being, knowing us more intimately than we know ourselves. This intimate knowledge becomes a potent tool for manipulation, as they can orchestrate stimuli to alter our perceptions and decisions, all in pursuit of maximizing their profits. Under the guise of enhancing user experience, they monitor and surveil us, blurring the boundaries between personal autonomy and corporate surveillance. In this way, the temple of our existence is transformed into a marketplace of manipulation, where our most private thoughts and actions are leveraged for financial gain. Yet amidst this encroachment, we must remain vigilant guardians of our sovereignty, resisting the commodification of our identities and reclaiming the sanctity of our temples. The temple is not intended to be a marketplace. Markets are based on profit and greed. The temple is a place to commune with God, a house of prayer and meditation. By placing themselves in the temple, the money changers change the atmosphere from one of reverence to one of trading, turning it into a den of thieves. Jesus' rebuke echoes to our day. Our minds and bodies have been invaded by ideas, products, and services. Many of these infiltrate our sacred space using deception. Many people are waking up to the fact that the entertainment and news media are tools for psychological operations designed to uphold state narrative through deception and manipulate our inner thoughts.
It's going to sound a little bit crazy, but I think the free speech debate is a complete distraction right now. I think the real debate should be about free will. And we feel it right now because we are being programmed. We're being programmed based on what we say we're interested in. And we are told through these discovery mechanisms what is interesting. And as we engage and interact with this content, the algorithm continues to build more and more of this bias. But the algorithm, even if it's open source, is effectively a black box. You cannot predict 100% of the time how it's going to work, what it's going to show you. And it can be moved and changed at any time. And because people become so dependent upon it, it's actually changing and impacting the agency we have, the free agency we have. And I think the only answer to this is not to work harder at open sourcing algorithms or making them more explainable about what they're doing and why they're doing it, but to give people choice. Give people choice of what algorithm they want to use from a party that they trust. Give people choice to build their own algorithm that they can plug in on top of these networks and see what they want, and they can shift them out as well. And give people choice to have really a marketplace around an algorithm that you can choose. I want to use this for these reasons. I don't trust that party anymore, so I'm not going to use this, or I'm not going to use anything at all. I want to be the discovery mechanism. And that's really the biggest problem and why these corporations became so large and so valuable.
Bitcoin, the braided whip. How do we drive the money changers out of the temple? Jesus braided a whip and physically and verbally assaulted the money changers. It was an intentional, premeditated action to drive them out. Today, we need similar intentional actions to resist the psyops and deceptions of the money changers. In this narrative, Bitcoin can be seen as a whip in the hands of Jesus. It strikes the money changers, overturning their tables. Bitcoin is already doing this, absorbing more and more economic energy from the global economy. As the world de-dollarizes, more and more value flows into this trustless network. Bitcoin is the antithesis of the fiat system. It's based on sovereignty, self-custody, on trustlessness. It's grounded in truth, code, and mathematics, which are transparent and can be verified. Bitcoin is voluntary, whereas fiat is imposed by force. Bitcoin is decentralized. The fiat system is built on centralization. Bitcoin has no CEO, no leader, and it can't be turned off. In the Gospel of Mark, it says Jesus overturned the chairs or the seats of the money changers with his whip. Could Bitcoin be the whip that overturns the central bankers and their chairman? If not Bitcoin, we face the prospects of central bank digital currencies, transhumanism, and slavery. Whoever has ears, let him hear. Bitcoin stands in complete opposition to the current deceptive control system imposed by the kings of the earth. It appeared suddenly and mysteriously. Whoever has ears, let him hear. This is the battle between deception and truth. Bitcoin separates money and state. It takes the most powerful tool of molding reality out of the hands of the money changers. The philosophy and economics of Bitcoin are morally and technically superior to the current system imposed on us. In this way, Bitcoin disrupts and overturns the money changers' tables and the central bankers. It removes the power of the printing press from the hands of corrupt individuals who have engaged in nefarious activities in the past. Our bodies are temples of God, and our consciousness has been invaded by the bankers. By embracing Bitcoin, we can separate money and state. And in doing so, we can drive the money changers and their surveillance-based model out of our holy temples, transforming them from a den of thieves back into a house of prayer and communion with God.